Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairy Tales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, this is Varietal Literature's YouTube channel, which is a little cozy corner of the internet for narrative. And what we're going to do here tonight is we are going to read old folklore and fairy tales. Sorry, I'm just got to adjust my headphones a bit. There we go. Specifically, we're going to read some Swedish folklore tonight from the Swedish Fairy Book, which is a book. It's an older book. It's over 100 years old at this point, but you can get it from for free on Project Gutenberg's page. And we're going to read a story from it called The Princess and the Glass Mountain. And I'm going to say a little bit about it in the beginning here, and then we're going to go into the story and tell it the best I can. If you just want to get to the story and you're not watching this live, down in the description below there will be timestamps, and those timestamps will take you right to the beginning of the story, and you can skip over any of the commentary or my discussion with chat or anything that you're not interested in. If you are here live, though, you can jump into the chat where there's a little crop of potatoes already talking to each other, and I see GS, Jumstore, Lizzie Rose, and Zombie Wolf. It's good to see you folks. We're officially into August. How is August treating you? For me, it's a little warm. We had some excitement here in my province where there was a landslide over one of our major rivers far north. And it backed up the river for several days, and there was concern that it was going to pummel the entirety of the cities that line this very long river that runs through our entire province. But so far, it looks like it has largely just been, disruptive, but not super destructive. So that was our excitement this week, other than just being hot. How are things in your neighborhood out there, folks? If you're drinking tea, what kind of tea are you drinking? It's too warm for me today. I can't drink tea today. I'm sorry, Jumpstore. Speaking of warm, if we go too long and I chat too much, my computer is going to give up. So I won't waste any more time. I will talk to you a little bit about the story tonight, and then I will get to reading that tale for all y'all. Zombie Wolf says, I wanted to tell Rory that the reason why his tomatoes might be so bland is because tomatoes actually lose their flavor if the temperature drops below 10 degrees Celsius. I think that's part of it. I think also, I can remember no relevant name about this, but I watched a very interesting documentary on, it was a series on Netflix where they would follow one sort of legendary chef around for a season. And this guy in particular was a southern chef whose name has left my mind, as has the name of the show, as has everything that would be helpful. But anyways, he talked at length about something that you probably already know about, which is that originally, when you were in a farmer's market economy, you would try to grow the best tomatoes because that's what would get people to come to your table and sell you out every time. But when you were put in a setting where you have to meet quotas for factory farming institutes like Del Monte or whatever, who are just collecting up a certain volume to fill orders, what became favored was high yield crops. And the problem, of course, is what makes a crop flavorful is the nutrition of the soil and the sun. And there's only so much nutrition that you can pull from the sun or the soil in a season or even an area. And so what happens is you get ones that are largely plumped up by their increased water content. So even when we have hothouse tomatoes, which is largely what we get here, to deal with that cold problem, there are seeds that are made, that are bred, that were basically designed for yield, and yield isn't flavor. You can still get what's called heirloom seeds, and apparently they're quite good. I've had an heirloom tomato, and it definitely tasted better. But yeah, I think one of the more famous applications of that is corn. The point where factory farming and quota farming sort of took over, you start seeing cornbread recipes that require sugar to be added. Prior to that, that was not the case. And a common interpretation of that was like, Well, that's because everyone's palate got worse as food became more processed. But actually, what's likely happening there is there used to be a much higher sugar content in the cornmeal that was used. And then as the way that corn is grown changed, it got blander. And so they had to add their own sugar. Anyways, this has absolutely nothing to do with the show tonight. Yeah, let's talk about things relevant to the show tonight. So tonight's story is called The Princess and the Glass Mountain. And if you are an OG watcher of this show, which not many people are, because I'm talking back when I had like 4 to 5 views an episode, then you would remember that I did do a story about a glass mountain before. Although I think in that case it was 2 brothers trying to get princesses. I think there was actually 3 princesses off a glass mountain. So why am I reading another one like this? How is it different, and so on? Well, some of it is just going to be watched. I could probably read that original story here again, and no one would probably know because it wasn't very popular. It was a Swedish story, as I recall, the original one as well. But in general, this sort of trope of the glass mountain seems to be a Nordic thing. I sort of became curious about it this week and was looking around. So I have read a story in this basic form before of a princess on a glass mountain, and she will marry, or the king will give him kingdom or whatever to whoever retrieves her from the glass mountain. The sort of details shift a lot as to why she's on the glass mountain and so on. This one is different than the other story in that way. It does seem to be a mainly Nordic origin thing as a story form. I couldn't really find any examples outside of like the Nordic band of folklore. But what's interesting to me, and I sort of went back and forth whether it was worth sort of spoiling it here or not. But the first act tacks on an element we have also seen before, also in the Swedish folklore. I'm not going to go into depth on it because it's a spoiler, but it has to do with the prince. Although really, I don't know how much you can spoil a fairy tale, but just in case. Anyways, I think perhaps actually the most unexpected element of the story is the dwarf in it. He does serve the narrative in an expected way, as any magical creature would, given the conceit. But exactly how he comes into the tale is interesting to me, and I don't really have a lot of developed thoughts about it, but it just caught my interest, and I'll see how you feel, folks out there feel about it. None of this is unheard of, is just to make the point. As I've often made this example before, the ways that story form is probably pretty well understood as the way that like genetics evolve. What you'll start to see is things that share traits becoming more and more divergent until they are their own thing. And we see that here. Like, yes, there is a collection of glass mountain stories, and yes, they tend to be Swedish or Norwegian or Nordic in general. And yeah, there's usually a princess on them, but exactly like how they get around that point and why the mountain is glass and so on and so forth, how much they feel they need to explain, it varies. And it also contains other sort of recognizable story forms and plot points, and that's how stories develop. That's how we get to a modern day story, is we can sort of watch it happen over history when you read folklore. Jum Story says, I love the stories. Jum Story says, I love the stories where the king or princess. I've never seen ones with queens or princes. I have seen one with a prince. I'll say that, but never queens. No. Ask their love interest protagonist to do an impossible task to prove their love, worthiness, or both. Well, this one at least has an interesting reason to me, because it's the one I haven't seen it. There's an interesting reason why she gets put on a mountain. It's not good. It's kind of mean, but that she gets put there, but at least it takes the time to reason it a bit more than just prove your love. Okay, that's enough of me babbling. This story opens with a king hunting. So let's... Pardon me for a moment. Just setting some stuff up. I thought I had. Also, if at any point the show just cuts off, just know that's my computer giving up. She's an old girl. All right. Our story tonight comes to us from the Swedish fairy book, and it is called The Princess and the Glass Mountain, and it deals with this glass mountain trope we see in Swedish folklore. If you want to read this story yourself, the Swedish fairy book is available on Project Gutenberg for free, as Project Gutenberg is there to do, because it is an old book. Once upon a time, there was a king who took such a joy in the chase that he knew no greater pleasure than hunting wild beasts. Early and late, he camped in the forest with hawk and hound. And good fortune always followed his hunting. But it chanced one day that he could rouse no game, and though he tried in every direction since morning, and then when evening was coming on and he was about to ride home, he saw a dwarf, or a wild man, running through the forest before him. And so the king at once spurred on his horse, rode after the dwarf in chase, and seized him. And he was surprised at this strange appearance of the little wild man, for he was small and ugly like a troll. His hair was as stiff as bean straw. But no matter what the king said to him, the little man would return no answer nor say a single word, one way or another. And this angered the king, who was already out of sorts because of his ill success at the hunt. And he ordered his people to seize the wild man and guard him carefully lest he escape. And then the king rode home. Now, his people said to him, "You should keep the wild man a captive here at court, in order that the whole country may talk of what a mighty huntsman you are. Only you should guard him so that he does not escape, because he is of a sly and treacherous disposition." And when the king had listened to them, he said nothing for a long time, and then he replied, "I will do as you say, and if the wild man escape, it shall be no fault of mine. But I vow that whoever shall let him go will die without mercy, and though he were my own son." The following morning, as soon as the king awoke, he remembered his vow, and he at once sent for wood and beams and had a small house or cage built quite close to the castle. The small house was built of great timbers, protected by strong locks and bolts, so that none could break in, and a peephole was left in the middle of the wall through which food might be thrust. And when everything was completed, the king had the wild man led up, placed in the small house, and he himself took and kept the key. There the dwarf had to sit a prisoner day and night, and the people came afoot on a horseback to gaze at him, and yet no one ever heard him complain or so much utter a single word. Thus matters went for some time. Then a war broke out in the land, and the king had to take to the field. For in these times, the king was the general. That was really what ultimately was supposed to justify him until the whole bloodline trace it to Adam thing happened. And at parting, he said to the queen, "You must rule now in my stead, and I leave land and people in your care. But there is one thing you must promise me you will do. You must guard the wild man securely so that he does not escape while I am away." And the queen promised to do her best in all respects, and the king gave her the key to the wild man's cage. Thereupon, he had his long galleys, his sea wolves, which is a great name for a ship, by the way, push out from the shore, hoisted sail, and took his course far, far away to the other country. Now, the king and the queen had only one child, a prince, and he was still small, yet great in promise. I feel like the people who write these stories have never met kids. What kid is great in promise when they're still small? Anyways, now when the king had gone, it chanced one day that the little fellow was wandering about the royal courtyard and came to the wild man's cage. And he began to play with an apple of gold that the wild man had. And while he was playing with it, it happened that suddenly the apple fell through the window in the wall of the cage. And the wild man at once appeared, and he threw back the apple. This seemed a merry game to the little fellow, and so he threw the apple in again, and the wild man threw it out again. And thus they played back and forth, back and forth, for quite a while. And yet for all the game had been so pleasant, it turned to sorrow in the end. For the wild man, on playing after a while, grabbed that apple of gold and kept it, and he would not give it back to the little prince. And when all was of no avail, neither threats nor prayers, the little fellow at last began to weep. And it was then that the wild man said his first words. "Your father did ill to capture me. You'll never get your apple of gold again unless you let me out." And the little fellow, the prince, answered, "And how can I let you out? Just you give me back my apple again, my apple of gold." And then the wild man said, "You must do what I now tell you. Go up to your mother, the queen. Beg her to comb your hair. And then see to it that you take the key from her girdle. And come back and unlock my door. After that, you can return the key in the same way without anyone knowing anything about it." After the wild man had talked to the boy in this way, he finally did as he said, went up to his mother, begged her to comb his hair, and took that key from her girdle. Then he ran down to the cage and opened the door, and when they parted, the dwarf said, "Here's your apple of gold, and that I promised that I'd give back to you. And I thank you for setting me free. And in another time when you have need of me, I will help you in turn." And with that, he ran off on his own way. But the prince went back to his mother and returned the key in the same way he'd taken it. Now, of course, as was inevitable, when they learned that at the king's court that the wild man had broken out, there was great commotion. And the queen sent people over hill and dale to look for him, but he was gone, and he stayed gone. Thus matters went on for a while, and the queen grew more and more unhappy, for she expected her husband to return every day, and when he did reach shore, his first question was whether the wild man had been well guarded. And then the queen would have to confess how matters stood, and told him how everything had happened. But the king was enraged beyond measure, and said he would punish the malefactor, no matter who he might be. And he ordered a great investigation at his court, and every human being in it had to testify. But no one knew anything. And at last, the little prince also had to come forward. And as he stood before the king, he said, "I know that I have deserved my father's anger, yet I cannot help but hide the truth, for I let out the wild man." And then the queen turned white, and the others as well, for there was not one who was not fond of the prince. And at last, the king spoke. I think we all know where priorities in this time were supposed to be. "Never shall it be said of me that I was false to my vow, even for the sake of my own flesh and blood. No, you must die the death you have deserved." And with that, he gave the order to take the prince to the forest and kill him. And they were to bring back the boy's heart as a sign that his command had been obeyed. Which is a thing we've seen in stories before. And the way they deal with it, we've seen as well. Now sorrow, unheard of, reigned among the people, and all pleaded for the little prince, but the king's word could not be recalled. His serving men did not dare disobey, and took the boy in their midst and set forth. And when they'd gone a long way into the forest, they saw a swineherd tending his pigs. Now it was here that one said to the other, "It doesn't seem right for me to lay hands on the king's son. Let's buy a pig instead and take its heart, and then all will believe it is the heart of the prince." The other serving men thought that he spoke wisely, so they bought a pig from the swineherd and led it into the wood and butchered it and took its heart. Then they told the prince to go his way and never return, and they themselves went back to the king's castle, and it is easy to imagine what grief they caused when they told of the prince's death. How they've also proved that unquestioned authority is nonsense. The king's son did what the serving men had told him. I mean, what choice did the boy have? He kept on wandering as far as he could, never had any other food than the nuts and wild berries that grow in the forest. And when they had wandered far and long, he came to a mountain upon whose very top stood a fir tree. Said he to himself, "After all, I might as well climb the fir tree and see whether I can find a path anywhere." No sooner had he done. No sooner, said than done, he climbed the tree. And as he sat in the very top of its crown and looked about on every side, he saw a large and splendid royal castle rising in the distance and gleaming in the sun. And then he grew very happy, and at once set forth in that direction. And on the way he met a farmhand who was ploughing, and begged him to change clothes with him, which he did. Thus fitted out, he at last reached the king's castle, went in and asked for a place, and was taken on as a herdsman to tend the king's cattle. Also really common in stories, I feel like the king probably doesn't have a lot of openings for strangers, but that's how the tales go. Now he went to the forest early and late, and in the course of time forgot his grief, grew up, and became so tall and brave that his equal could not be found. And now our story turns to the king. Not the king who sent his son away to die over a weird vow that no one asked him to make, but rather the king of this castle for which the former king's son worked. He was reigning at the splendid castle, and he had been married, and he had an only daughter, and she was lovelier by far than other maidens, and had so kind and cheerful a disposition that whoever could someday take her to his home might well consider himself fortunate. Now, when the princess had completed her 15th year, what a way to say an age, as I've completed my 30th year. A quite unheard of swarm of suitors made their appearance, as may well be imagined. And for all that, she said no to all of them, and they only increased in numbers. And at last the princess said, "None other shall win me, save who he can ride up the high glass mountain in full armor." And the king thought this a good suggestion, and he approved of his daughter's wish, and had proclaimed throughout the land and the kingdom that none other should have the princess save he who could ride up the glass mountain in full armor. And when the day set by the king had arrived, the princess was led up the glass mountain, and there she sat on its highest peak, with a golden crown on her head and a golden apple in her hand, and she looked so immeasurably lovely that there was no one who would not have liked to risk his life for her. So just below the foot of the hill, all the suitors had assembled. Slightly smaller crowd than before, but not that much smaller. She was quite pretty, apparently. Anyways, they had splendid horses and glittering armor. Fantastic. It shone like fire in the sun, and from round about the people flocked together in great crowds to watch their tilting. And when everything was ready, the signal was given by horns and trumpets, and then the suitors, one after another, raced up the mountains with all their might. But the mountain was high and as slippery as ice for its crystal nature, and besides it was steep beyond all measure, a spire at best. And not one of the suitors rode up more than a little way before he tumbled down again, head over heels, and it might well happen that arms and legs were broken in the process, and this made so great a noise, together with the neighing of the horses and the shouting of the people, and the clash of arms, that the tumult, and the shouting could be heard from far away. And while all this was going on, the king's son, for his part, the one we started this story discussing, was rambling about with his oxen deep in the woods. And when he heard all the tumult and the clashing of arms, he sat down on a stone and leaned his cheek on his hand. And became lost in thought. For it had occurred to him how gladly he would have fared forth with the rest. It was then, suddenly, that he heard footsteps. And when he looked up, who was it but the wild man that he had traded a key for a golden apple? And he was standing right before him.
"Thank you for last time," said he. "And why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?"
"Well," said the prince, "I have no choice but to be sad and joyless. Because of you, I am a fugitive from the land of my father, and now I have not even a horse and armor to ride up the glass mountain and fight for that princess."
"Ah," said the wild man, "if that be all you want, then I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn."
And then he took the prince by the hand and led him deep, deep, deep down into the earth, into a cave, and behold, there hung a suit of armor forged out of the hardest steel, and so bright that a blue gleam played around its edges. Right beside it stood a splendid steed, saddled and bridled, pawing at the earth with his steel hooves, chomping at his bit till white foam dropped to the ground. And the wild man said,
"Now, get quickly into your armor. Ride out. Try your luck. In the meantime, I will tend your oxen."
Well, the prince did not wait to be told a second time, but put on helmet and armor and buckled on his spurs and hung a sword at his side and felt as light in his steel armor as a bird in the air. And then he leapt into the saddle, and so that every clasp and buckle rang, and laid his reins on the neck of the steed and rode hastily towards the mountain. The princess's suitors were about to give up the contest, for none of them had won. Though each had done their very best. And while they stood there thinking it over, saying that perhaps fortune would favor them another time, they suddenly saw a youth ride out of the wood and straight toward the crystal mountain. He was clad in steel from head to foot, with helmet on his head, sword and belt, and shield on his arm, and he sat his horse with such knightly grace that it was a pleasure to look upon him. And at once all eyes turned to the strange knight, and all asked who he might be, for none had ever seen him before, and yet they had but little time for talk and questions, for no sooner had he cleared the wood than he rose in his stirrups and gave his horse the spurs and shot forward like an arrow straight up the glass mountain. And yet, he did not ride up all the way, for when he reached the middle of the steep ascent, he suddenly flung around his steed and rode down again, so that the sparks flew from his horse's hooves. And then he disappeared into the woods. like a bird in flight. Now, one may imagine the excitement which now seized upon the people. And there was not one who did not admire the strange knight. All agreed they had never seen a braver knight. But of course, he did not succeed. Time passed. The princess's suitors decided to try their luck a second time. The king's daughter was once more led up the glass mountain with great pomp and richly gowned, and was seated on the topmost peak, with a golden crown on her head and a golden apple, indeed, in her hand. And at the foot of the hill gathered all the suitors with handsome horses and splendid armor. And round about stood all the people to watch the contest. And when all was ready, the signal was given by horns and trumpets. And at the same moment, the suitors, one after another, darted up the mountain with all their might on the backs of their horses. But all took place as it did the first time. The mountain was high and as slippery as ice, and besides it was steep all beyond measure, and not one rode up more than a little way before tumbling again down head over heels. Meanwhile there was much noise, and the horses neighed, and the people shouted, and the armor clashed, so that the tumult and the shouting sounded far, far off into the deep wood. And while all this was going on, the young prince was tending his oxen, which was his duty. But when he heard the tumult and the clashing of arms, he sat down on a stone, and he leaned his cheek on his hand, and he wept. And for he thought of the king's beautiful daughter, and it occurred to him how much he would like to take part and ride with the rest. Well, as it was before, he heard footsteps, and when he looked up, the wild man was standing before him, that little dwarf he'd let go.
"Good day," said the wild man. "Why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?"
And thereupon the prince replied, "I have no choice but to be sad and joyless. Because of you I am a fugitive from the land of my father. Now I have not even a horse and armor to ride up the mountain and fight for the princess."
"Ah," said the wild man, "if that be all you want, then I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn."
Then he took the prince by the hand and led him deep, deep, deep down in the earth into his cave. And there on the wall hung a suit of armor altogether forged of the clearest silver, and so bright that it shone afar. And right beside it stood a snow-white steed, saddled and bridled, pawing the earth with his silver hooves, and champing at his bit till the foam drooped to the ground. And the wild man said,
"Quickly get into your armor, ride out, try your luck, and in the meantime I will tend your oxen."
Why? The prince did not wait to be told a second time, but put on his helmet and armor in all haste, securely buckled on his spurs, and hung his sword at his side, and felt as light in his silver armor as a bird in the air. And then he leaped into the saddle so that every clasp and buckle rang, and laid his reins on the neck of the steed, and rode hastily towards
the glass mountain.
And the princess's suitors were about to give over the contest, for none of them had won the prize, though each had played a man's part. And while they stood there thinking it over, saying that perhaps fortune would favor them the next time, they suddenly saw the youth ride out of the wood and straight towards the mountain. He was clad in silver from head to foot, with helmet on head and shield on arm and sword at side, and he sat his horse with such knightly grace that a braver-looking youth had probably never been seen. At once all eyes turned towards him, and the people noticed that he was the same knight who had appeared before. But the prince did not leave them much time for wonderment, for no sooner had he reached the plain below the mountain than he rose in his stirrups, spurred on his horse, and rode like fire straight up the steep mountain. And yet he did not ride quite up to the top. But when he had come to its crest, he greeted the princess with great courtesy, flung about his steed, and rode down the mountain again till the sparks flew about his horse's hooves. Then he disappeared into the wood as the storm flies. As one may imagine, the people's excitement was even greater than the first time. There was not one who did not admire the strange knight, and all were agreed that a more splendid steed or handsome youth was nowhere to be found. Well, time passed. The king set a day when his daughter's suitors were to make a third trial. The princess was now more led to the glass mountain and seated herself on its led to the glass mountain and seated herself on its highest peak, with the golden crown and the golden apple as she had before. And at the foot of the mountain again gathered a whole swarm of suitors, with splendid horses and polished armor, handsome beyond anything seen thus far, and round about the people flocked to watch the contest. When all was ready, the suitors, one after another, darted up the mountain with all their might. But the mountain was as smooth as ice, and besides it was steep beyond all measure, so that not one rode up more than a little way before tumbling back down again, head over heels. And this made a great noise, and the horses neighed, and the people shouted, and the armor clashed till the tumult and the shouting echoed far, far, far into the wood. While this was all taking place, the king's son was busy tending his oxen as usual. And when he once more heard the noise and the clash of arms, he sat down on a stone, leaned his cheek on his hand, and wept bitterly. And then he thought of the lovely princess, and would gladly have ventured his life to win her. That very moment, the wild man was standing before him.
"Good day," said the wild man. "And why do you sit here so lonely and full of sorrow?"
"I have no choice but to be sad and joyless," said the prince. "Because of you, I am a fugitive from the land of my father. Now I have not even a sword and armor to ride up the mountain and fight for the princess."
Said the wild man, "if that be all that troubles you, I can help you. You helped me once before, and now I will help you in turn."
And with that, he took the prince by the hand and led him into his cave deep down under the earth and showed him a suit of armor all forged of the purest gold, gleaming so bright that its golden glow shone far and wide. Beside it stood a magnificent steed, saddled and bridled, pawing the earth with its golden hooves and champing at its bit until the foam fell to the ground. And the wild man said, "Now, get quickly into your armor, ride out and try your luck. In the meantime, I will tend your oxen." And to tell the truth, the prince was not lazy, but put on his helmet and armor, buckled on his golden spurs, and hung his sword at his side, felt as light in this armor as a bird in the air. And then he leaped into the saddle so that every clasp and buckle rang, laid his reins on the neck of his steed, and rode hastily towards the mountain. The princess suitors were about to give up the contest, for none of them had won the prize, though each had done his best. And while they stood there thinking over what was to be done, they suddenly saw a youth come riding out of the woods and straight toward the mountain. He was clad in gold from head to foot, with the golden helmet on his head, the golden shield on his arm, the golden sword on his side, and so knightly was his bearing that a bolder warrior could not have been met with in all the wide world. At once all eyes were turned towards him, and one could see that he was the same youth who had already appeared twice before. But the prince gave them but little time to question and wonder, for no sooner that he'd reached the plain than he gave his horse the spurs, and he shot up the steep mountain like a flash of lightning. And when he'd reached its highest peak, he greeted the beautiful princess with great courtesy, and he kneeled before her and received the golden apple from her hand. Then he flung about his steed and rode down the glass mountain again, so that the sparks flew about the golden hooves of his horse, and a long ribbon of golden light gleamed behind him, and at last he disappeared into the woods like a star. And what a commotion now reigned about the mountain! The people broke forth into cheers that could be heard from far away. The horns sounded. Trumpets called, horses neighed, arms clashed, and the king had proclaimed far and near that the unknown golden knight had won the prize. Now all that was wanting was some information about the golden knight, for no one knew him, and all the people expected that he would at once make his appearance at the castle, but he did not come. He didn't. This caused great surprise. The princess grew pale and ill. But the king was put out, and so the suitors murmured and found fault day by day, and at length they were all at their wits' end finally. The king had a great meeting, announced at his castle, which every man, high and low, was to attend, so that the princess might choose among them herself. There was no one who was not glad for the princess's sake, and also because it was a royal command and the countless number of people gathered together. And when they had all assembled, the princess came out of the castle with great pomp. Pretty as she was, followed by her maids, and passed through the entire multitude, but no matter how much she looked about her on every side, she did not find the one for whom she was looking. And when she reached the last row, she saw a man who stood quite hidden by the crowd. He had a flat cap and a wide gray mantle, such as shepherds wear, but its hood was drawn up so that his face could not be seen. And at once the princess ran up to him drew down his hood, and fell upon his neck and cried, "Here he is, here he is!" Well, then all the people laughed. For when they saw it was the king's herdsman, the king himself called out, "No! May God console me for the son-in-law who is to be my portion." The man, however, was not at all abashed, but replied, "Oh, you need not worry about that at all, for I am just as much a king's son as you are a king." And with that he flung aside his wide mantle, and there were none left to laugh, for instead of the grey herdsman, there stood a handsome prince, clad in gold from head to foot, and holding the princess's golden apple in his hand. And all could see that it was the same youth who had ridden up the glass mountain. And then they prepared a feast whose like had never been seen, and the prince received the king's daughter, and with her half of the kingdom thenceforward they lived happily in their kingdom. And if they have not died, they are living there still. But nothing more was ever heard of the wild man. And that is the end. Zombie Wolf says, all that armor, shield, sword are literally useless. Gold is too soft for anything more than ceremonial and decorative. To be fair, most knights wore ceremonial nonsense. My partner does what's called HEMA, which is like historical sword fighting. And I get to go down and look at the old armor sets. Practical armor, kind of ugly, honestly. It's bulbous because it needs to deflect stuff. Like, it's not cool. It doesn't have ornate decorations because those catch sword blades, right? And you want them to slide off. But they also have some pictures, at least, of ornate pieces that were never meant for combat. And that's mostly what kings would wear out. And it's actually, by the way, why I chose the icon picture that I chose. The icon picture is show pony armor. That's not practical, but it probably was real. Probably something a knight or an earl's son of some sort, anyways, which were usually knights, would have worn. Zombie Wolf says, I don't know about you, but if I saw my monarch's daughter so richly dressed, and depending on the state of the economy, I might feel a bit bitter about where my taxes obviously went. And GS says, a few have shared your sentiment before you, Zombie Wolf. Indeed. You know, as much as commoners try to get painted as like doubtful to their king and dumb as a brick, they weren't. They were just people who were unlucky, and they were well aware they were getting screwed. Lizzie Rose says, but why did he ride down? Now, I had that same thought the first time I read this story. I was like, what is going on? By the way, we're at the end of the story. Only the most hardcore are going to be here listening, so I'm turning on my air conditioning. On the second read, it became clearer to me that, well, it never explicitly says it. His horse can't make it. I don't think there's really much reason for it other than tension, but they describe where he gets to, and with each horse he gets higher, but then he has to turn back. Now, it is possible that this has some reference to an older tale. The footnotes at the end of this, which I caution you against trusting footnotes from this era. A lot of the research on folklore at this time is not particularly trustworthy. This is like over 100 years ago. But I do want to read you, because I do find their folklore, or their note here, interesting, their end note on the story, and believable. Very popular throughout the North is The Princess on the Glass Mountain. And I was talking about how Glass Mountain tales in the North are something that comes up. Who may be looked upon as a relative of the Brunhilde of heroic legend, who may be brought down from her inaccessible height only by the bravest of the brave. And I thought that was interesting because I can definitely see a connection there. The wild man who appears in the part of a magician to aid the hero, which is an interesting interpretation, is a familiar figure in Northern legend. It's not just Northern legend. The magician that you do a kind turn for that helps you through your trials that no one else can succeed at is like 90% of all fairy tales from all over Europe. And actually beyond Europe. But I know that less, so I'm not going to be so confident in that statement. King Harold Harfager, according to the book of Flatjar, released a wild man of this kind from captivity at his father's court when a boy of 5. But I do think the comparison to Brunhilde is interesting. Because, yeah, there's a lot of princesses up on glass mountains or princesses up places that are hard to get, and then you gotta complete the contest to get them. What I did like about this, though, is that she just was so popular, she did it to thin her choices. And that it was her choice was very interesting to me as well. Lizzie Rose also says, gotta say, the sound effects are on point today. Well, thank you. You know, honestly, I can't take too much credit for that. I think people have probably put this together by now, but I use tabletop audio for a lot of my sound effects. And sometimes I want more sound effects. I have downloaded sound effects with the program that I use for the music that I pay a monthly fee for, but I get the rights to the music forever. Not forever in perpetuity, but for the months that I've used them, I don't have to worry that it's going to get pulled on a copyright claim. Has some sound effects I've downloaded for some stuff, but sometimes I just don't have the sound effects I need or want. Now, Jump Store, that's a thought I didn't have, but I like. The Golden Knight wins. What convinced you to pick him? The king. Well, All's Gold made a very persuasive argument. Yeah, if you show up in the solid gold armor, that makes a point, doesn't it? Jump Store says, did you notice Hira popping in, Rory? I did, but I'd forgotten. Thank you for reminding me, Jump Store. Hello, Hira. Thank you very much for telling me where Tammy is. We do sometimes worry. We're a bit of a worry-prone bunch. We've talked about that before. Also, hello, Uncle Kitty, and if you're out there and working, Janera, you're always missed. GS says, the Finnish female hammer thrower at the Olympics today looked like Brunhilde. She was epic. Red hair. I did see her. She looked terrifying. That's no commentary on her looks or whatever. She was just built huge. She looked like she could crush me with one hand. Zombie Wolf says, random trivia. The first person to win an Oscar for Best Actor was German actor Emil Jannings. Unfortunately, Emil turned out to be a vehement, not amazing person, shall we say. I like how you got around that. I think we all kind of know what that means. And went on to star in many not amazing people's propaganda film. Mm-hmm. You know, I did some film classes in my time. As much as I like stories in general, I should say. I've mentioned this before. I like films, games, and books in pretty much equal weight. But I was also a very big film buff, so I did a lot of film classes from development to understanding them and whatever else, just for the hell of it, not for a degree exactly, breadth requirements at best. Anyways, and the not so amazing people films came up, of course, because I won't even say her name, but the director of their propaganda was, let's say, influential on some of the language of film. But then some years later, I saw, I think it's a Dan Olsen video, which is Folding Ideas on YouTube. He's a Alberta essayist. Did a video some years ago, I think it was, on Triumph of the Will and how it's just ultimately overstated. Its value is overstated. And he made a really compelling argument as to why its value got overstated in the first place and why it's overstated. And it was interesting because it was something that was handed to me that a sort of observation that I never really questioned and I found interesting. It's only interesting if you care about film theory. GS says imposing, and Jumpstore says we stand a fierce woman warrior. We do indeed. Yes. One of the things that I really like about some of the Nordic and Scottish stuff is, while it does have that traditional sort of patriarchal, sexist tones to it, where a woman just sits around and is pretty and waits for someone. They also, especially Scottish, has a lot of variety in how women behave as far as folklore goes. And I won't read too far into why that is. I'll just say that their stories are more likely to have a woman, save themselves or be a warrior or whatever else. Zombie Will says no need to mention her. Yeah, I'm not adding clout to her. I make no grace for somebody who's willing to back fascists. May you be forgotten. Anyways, on a brighter side, I'm glad a lot of people did tell me that they enjoyed the story, and I'm glad you enjoyed the story, because obviously it's a very traditional fairy tale, and it has that repetitive rule of 3. And I had a thought about that. That I've never had before, and I'm sure about 50,000 other people have had before me. But I did want to share it. When I first was reading folklore, like my first year, it was a lot more fairy tales than folklore, because I hadn't quite figured out where the sources were or exactly even how it worked. When I started, I didn't know much about it. It was a way of learning about a thing that interested me. And I would see the repetition, and I knew the repetition occurred. Sorry, I have to do that once a stream, don't I? I would see it occur in stories I'd seen, in adaptations I'd seen up to that point, this rule of 3's repeated stuff. The thing is, though, I never really liked it, and I didn't get it. Because for me, it was like, well, this is just padding on the story, right? This is a way to fluff out the story. Over the years, I've grown to like it. I don't know why, because it is almost exactly the same every time, but there's always little changes. Not just changes in this case, the type of armor he picks up, but there's also little changes in how they phrase it. And it occurred to me today, maybe a few days ago, this week anyways, it occurred to me that this is basically like the chorus of a song. And I know that a lot of traditional bardic deliveries were musical in nature. I don't know if that's true for Sweden exactly, but I do know that in general, bardic arts, like I know for sure Slavic bardic arts up until like the 40s, you had otherwise illiterate bards who would travel around and sing tales. But anyways, I realized that they're choruses to a song. They have slight developments and changes to them, but they cycle the sort of melody of the words until they reach their culmination on the third time. And I feel like that's kind of the root of that kind of pop cycle of repetition of something. But I don't know if everybody knows enough music to know this. Very often in songs, when you repeat a chorus, the chorus is never exactly the same. They add different harmonies, different emphasis in the mix, whatever else. And I feel like that's what's happening in these stories, and they repeat. Not always, but in general. And I feel like that one with this. And I think also there's just something comforting in the familiarity of it. Like, in all stories, you're suppressing your logic because this isn't real. So that on the third one it's going to succeed. There's no pride in knowing that. You're sort of just pretending like you're in tension, and then in that you usually are. Like, they're going to succeed, but you sort of just immerse yourself in the moment. Anyways, Zombie Will says, ever since watching The Witcher, every time I hear the word bard, I immediately think of Yeskir. Fair enough. It is a pretty reasonably accurate bard. Also, if you like folklore, man, I recommend the Witcher's short stories. They are heavily based on folklore, but they take it in different directions, which is my favorite thing. To take like really traditional mythology or really traditional stories and then do something that sort of inverts its meaning or does something weird with it. I love that. I haven't read all the Witcher stories, but I've read a lot of their earlier. They were originally sort of lightly interconnected common character stories, but where he would meet what was supposed to be a monster, and it turns out he's just a dude with, a bit of magical nature. I won't give away how the world of The Witcher works, but it's fantastical creatures. Jumpstore says, that was a good story tonight. Hope to see everyone on Thursday and have a good night. Yeah, reminder, Thursday. By the way, reminder Thursday, we're doing Grimoire. We're actually going to be writing some of the, utilizing some of the spell creating mechanics. But that video, I went to bed on Friday and I woke up on Saturday and it had 500 more views than when I went to bed. If you're watching because of the Grimoire video, welcome. I meant to say that in the beginning. You're probably not here in the end. But thanks for giving me a shot, and I hope you enjoy it on Thursday, because that's where we'll be engaging with the rest of it. Anyways, that's enough blabbing from me. That's me just taking a lap, because I know it's just me. Anyhow, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. I no longer trust my memory of everybody who dropped by, so everybody who dropped by or is lurking, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the story. Again, if you want to read this one yourself, you can find the Swedish Fairy book on Project Gutenberg. I'll keep the fire going, though. You have a good sleep.